of our class students is actually working at, Kyle. And from what I've heard, Kyle loves it there. It seems like they've got a lot of interesting stuff going on, super fast paced. But aside from that, actually, it all seems a bit under wraps. So maybe, Joe, I'll pass it over to you and you can do a bit of a intro and tell us what you're about.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you for having me. I'm always honored to be invited to things like this. And I always inevitably struggle at coming up with a topic that appeals to everybody. And I think there is something about, as an engineer myself, there's something about when you try to create reusable software and you try to build a module or a framework that everybody is going to be able to leverage, inevitably you run the risk of creating something that is designed for everybody and it's not really applicable to anybody and nobody can really use it. And I feel like there is a tendency for that to happen sometimes when you try to pick out a subject for a talk like this that's going to appeal to everybody. And I was recently reading a book by Annie Duke, who is she's a multiple time World Series of Poker winner and a behavioral psychologist, and she was referencing a study that has recently been done on dating apps, and so it was looking at Match.com and Tinder and Grindr and Christian Mingle and kind of that whole spectrum of dating apps, and they were trying to figure out who gets the most dates, which seems pretty basic. And probably not shockingly, it turns out that the people who get the most dates or the most swipes to the right are people who have like Hollywood level good looks, like the prettiest of the pretty. Not surprisingly, don't struggle to get dates. Brad Pitt and Selma Hayek, they're doing just fine. And it would logically make sense then that the people who are the second most successful in these things are maybe not Hollywood good looks, but good looking people. And it turns out that that's not the case. It turns out that the people who are second most I guess lucky in dating apps are people who are very, very unconventional. So if you have 20 face tattoos and bright green hair, you are going to do better than a good looking person who is not elite level good looks. And I feel like there is something really interesting to that, which is to say, if you want to be effective, don't necessarily try to play to a full audience. Try to find a sub audience who is really going to get you, and accept the fact that there's going to be folks who are in your audience who aren't going to have the same, you're not going to have the same impact for. So I'm going to be upfront about this and say I'm going to try to provide you all with some level of information or something that some percentage of you may take away and think, okay, I hadn't thought about something that way, or interesting, and that was part of his journey, and it's not really applicable to me. But it's going to be kind of a binary thing probably. So bear with me on it, but that's the kind of mentality that I'm going to take here. And what I was thinking, I was speaking with Jana when she and I were talking about, what do you want to talk about? And I said, what would be good? Like, what do you all feel you don't get when people come on and talk to you? And we kind of landed on, why don't you give us a little bit about your journey and maybe talk a little bit about what you're seeing from a technology trend perspective, and we can open it up and have some kind of Q&A at the end of it. So that's the approach that we're gonna take on this thing. Feel free to keep this as casual as anybody wants it to be. I'll be the first to admit that I wish I was a little bit more buttoned up for today. Full disclosure, it was about 6 o'clock last night, and I said to my wife, so I've got this engagement, I'm really working on this thing for a while. I said, here's what I'm going to talk about. And she goes, I hate it. I think it's horrible. I'm like, so I'm right off the bat, I'm like, well, maybe you're part of that 70% who, appreciates that I don't look like Brad Pitt, but isn't part of that 30% that I'm really going to resonate with. But at the same time, like her opinion is pretty important to me. So I did a little bit of a adjustment last night, which makes me feel a little bit more nervous about today. So bear with me. I have put together a bit of a presentation. which I will share with you. It should be popping up there. Let me just put this into slideshow. Okay, fantastic. So, everybody's career sits somewhere on this spectrum, and I have called out in particular here two extreme ends of it. On the left side of this is this idea of, look, I am just going to get this thing done so that I can pay the bills and live the life that I want to live. It's really just a means to it. And then the far side of it is this almost an obsession with what it is you're doing on a professional basis. When I think about the audience that I'm trying to talk to today, that I'm hoping to say something that resonates with some of them, it's certainly to the right of a means to an end. It doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who concerns themselves with their professional legacy. I will be the first to admit I am further to the right of the spectrum than most people. You spend a third of your life at work, you spend half of your conscious or waking hours at your job. And for me, being able to get meaning out of that, or more accurately, not being able to get meaning out of that would be a really, really hard thing for me to accept. And I think generally, I suspect that most of you probably sit somewhere to the right of the means to an end of that spectrum as well. As I understand it, you're all here because you are getting certified, you are maybe pivoting your career, you are making an investment into your professional life. So I feel like you are going to be closer. You know, you're going to be right to a right of a means to an end, and um, so you're taking these steps, and I think there's a woman who is the professional basketball coach of Duke University, a woman by the name of Kara Lawson, who is a really, really inspirational speaker. But she has a tendency to tell, or she tells her team that if you want to have a meaningful pursuit in your life, it's never going to be easy. And it's something that you really have to accept is nothing's ever easy. You know, this isn't a matter of, well, if I get my Salesforce certification, then stuff is going to be easier. If I get my AWS, you know, solution architect certification, things are going to be easy. That's just not the way it works in real life. And so her saying that I like a lot is, um, it's never easy. We need to learn how to handle hard better. And that's kind of the message that I want to say today is, as we continue to make these steps and these strides in our professional careers, we need to make sure that we are handling hard better. And I think about that a lot with the teams that I develop and the companies that I have built in the past. And I'm going to get into a little bit of my story in a second. But as people in my groups and in my teams start to do better at their jobs, start to be able to consistently be successful, inevitably, what do I do but give them more stuff? You know, I give them more responsibility, I give them more tasks, I give them more important and interesting work. So what was maybe easy for them becomes hard again. And part of what you all, I think, already understand, but I'm going to try to reinforce today, is the certification that you're doing right now, or the learning that you're doing right now, is something that you're going to do over and over and over again. This is a continuous thing. And I'm sure you know, Amber would agree, as somebody who's running her own company, even none of this is ever easy. It's always a matter of pushing yourself out of your comfort zone, experiencing that, you know, that kind of, you know, am I a poser here? Like, is this real? I don't know what I'm doing, and then doing what you have to do to bridge that gap. So all of that said, I'm really looking at folks who are somewhere to the right of that means to an end, and I hope that I can say something today that's going to resonate with some of you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own path, but before I do, I want to talk about something called adjacent possibles, and this is something I talk to my teams about a lot. Um, your adjacent possible is, I have it written down here so I don't get it wrong, the set of all the things that are possible in a given system at a given time. And I like the analogy that the author Stephen Johnson gives in a book called Where Good Ideas Come From. He says, if you walk into a house or walk into a room within a house, there's a door at the end of that room. If you walk through that door, you are now in a room that wasn't accessible before you walked into the other room. And with each subsequent room you walk into, new doors present themselves, new opportunities present themselves. And as I look back on how I got to the point that I am today, it has been a matter of me walking through doors and finding my adjacent possibles and letting that become part of what my career is completely comprised of. So I think the adjacent possibles are a really good way of thinking about how we come up with solutions, but it's also a really good way to think about how our career unfolds for us. So getting into my meandering journey on this, and this is my adjacent possibles, and I want to look at this, or I kind of plan to look at this a little bit through multiple lenses. The first one is admitting that by tech standards, I am a dinosaur. I've been in this space for more than a quarter of a century. My journey has taken me to a number of different places around the world, and specifically in the United States. I was born in a factory town in a flyover state in the middle of the US. I had a very, very unremarkable upbringing and background. I barely backed into an absolutely brutally horrible state university, which I like to refer to as the MIT of the Midwest because it's couldn't be further from the truth. And I was bartending my way through university, taking about 6.5 years to achieve my 4-year degree. And a regular came in with a friend of his and said, "This is Joel. He needs an internship," and that's how I landed my first gig. And I'm going to get into what the technology looked like for that, but it was just kind of one of those maybe serendipitous chance encounters that led to getting a foot in the door, and then finding that I was really passionate about what it was I was doing, and finding that I was really passionate about building solutions. And that has since taken me through a number of different industries and a number of different geographic locations. Excuse me. In addition to that, I've worn a number of different hats, and this all adds up to more than 100% because as a consultant, I had also founded a company that provided professional services. There's a little bit of overlap around those things. The reason that I call this out is I think it's interesting not only to think about all the different adjacent possibles that led to a series of different industries and a number of different locations, but also just the fact that every one of those steps, my job changed, and every one of those steps, I went back to accepting the fact that I needed to continue to grow as an individual and continue to push myself and continue to learn so that I could feel comfortable that the work that I was doing was becoming easy, which really meant that it was just time to move on to something else because I was starting to handle hard better at each of those different steps. And then the final thing that I kind of call out here is there's a couple of kind of easy read books that on the surface act as if they are at opposite ends of the spectrum. One of them is this book called Range that David Epstein wrote. He's the good Epstein, not the pedophile rapist. But Range really talks about generalists and how the world really needs people who have a wide range of skill sets. I have a data team right now that happens to have 2 individuals on it who both are analysts. One of them went the way of meteorology to end up in a space where she focuses on data science. The other one happened to also come out of meteorology, but ended up going becoming a qualitative researcher and then backing into like data visualization. And when I was I mention this because when I was at Netflix, we used to have the cream of the crop that would come to us and be part of our talent acquisition pipeline. And one of the things I always look for is, do they have something other than just computer science? Like, is there something interesting about these people that cause that collision of ideas to be different than what we would otherwise get? Causes their adjacent possibles to have walked a different path than maybe our kind of traditional just tech people did. And I think there's something really neat about limited, admittedly, but the what I know about Next Work and what I know about what Amber does is really gives folks an opportunity to pivot careers and to kind of change their reality. And that means that by extension there, that people really kind of fall on that generalist idea in that range. I think that's a really, really beautiful thing. On the far end of that spectrum, Malcolm Gladwell is kind of famous for having this book called Outliers that talks about this idea of, if you work 10,000 hours at something, you become an expert at it. And he calls out folks like Tiger Woods and I think Beethoven and I'm trying to think of who else was in there, but a bunch of people. Bill Gates is a really good example. But he talks a little bit about, Bill Gates had 10,000 hours of programming experience before he graduated from high school, and Tiger Woods had played 10,000 hours of golf before he was 15 years old. And da, 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 da. I think that number is kind of abstract. I also think it works really well for Americans because everybody gets 2 weeks off. Everybody works 40 hours a week, so 10,000 hours is 50 weeks times 40 hours a week. It means in 5 years' time you could be an expert in a thing. And these two books are kind of thought to be somewhat on opposite ends of the spectrum. I actually don't think that's the case. So I find that when I have reread the highlights that I have through Range, I think what I really pull out of that is you can gain expertise in a bunch of various different things as you discover your adjacent possibles. And developing that depth and that expertise in a specific thing doesn't prevent you from becoming a generalist when your full repertoire is a number of things that you're an expert at. And the reason that I call that out is, if I kind of walk through my technology path, and I will not bore you by reading all of these different things, I'll just kind of give you a bit of a synopsis of what this looked like in real life for me. I started out by writing IBM MVS JCL wrap SAS on an AS400, which is a mainframe. For you youngins who don't know that, I wish I was one of you. And I was building individual and household consolidation processes, which is to say that it's kind of in a real nutshell, what does that mean? This is way before anything. This is back pre kind of Y2K. And you were taking individuals, like maybe you had John Smith and Jay Smith and John Smith Jr., and trying to figure out which one was an actual individual and then who lived in their households, which seems like it's a pretty basic thing, and it probably is nowadays. When you apply that and then layer in some of the complexities around like cultures, for example, living in New York, um, the Puerto Rican culture has a tendency to have a multi-generation that might live in the same household. So you can end up with, Jose, who is a father and a son, and maybe a grandfather that all have the same name, that all live in the same household. So it became it was an interesting problem to solve at that point. I parlayed that into working with a kind of no code or low code application called Ab Initio, which I think is kind of an interesting thing. And the only reason I call it out is we are starting to see that trend come back again, this idea of no code and low code. And I have a tendency to hear people talk about it as if it is a real evolution of software, when in reality, I think it's just a cycle, and we're seeing it repeat itself. So if you go back to, say, the late 90s to the mid 2000s, there was kind of three applications that played in that space. One was called Ab Initio, another one was called Informatica, and then IBM had a really crappy one called Data Stage. And those three applications were these kind of idea of like drag and drop, and it would generate code that sat behind the scenes. The difference that we had with those solutions to the ones that we see emerging now is those solutions were, they had all of the technologies, within the application because all of that stuff existed on a server. Now we've got the cloud and we have various services. So the new generation of those type of tools is about putting together the services that a cloud or an offering has. So it's more of a low code or no code way of tying services together as opposed to kind of a all or nothing application that sat on a single server that you had plugged into, into a closet. um, from there, I moved into data warehousing, got really into RDBMS, got into SQL, star schemas, really invested in everything that Ralph Kimball taught. And this is back in the now kind of early 2000s. Started to lead some initiatives on behalf of the consultant firm that I was working on at that point. At this time, I'm in a company called Crate and Barrel, which is kind of upscale, like retail housing. Built out their data warehouse, then decided that I was going to move into a full-time leadership position. So I took my hands off the keyboard and went and did that for a little bit, then moved back to New York, started working on Wall Street. At that point, I founded my first tech company. We were doing some kind of interesting things with meta programming. We were basically, I was at Citi, and they recognized two things. The first one was they had company or branches all over the world, and each of those branches was essentially doing the same work, but they were recoding everything because everything was in different languages. So I was tasked with trying to come up with a way to create a meta programming solution that would allow them to input their inputs and have it generate all of the code to do all of their processing. So moved down to Buenos Aires for a little bit and tried to roll that out. Absolute devastatingly horrible failure. It was so incredibly over complex. It was such a unusable monolith. It was a really, really good learning experience. So Citi had at that point, I think was probably suffering a little bit from that sunk cost fallacy, but they did recognize that, look, okay, so it didn't work to do this metaprogramming thing and have all of these languages translate and have all of this code generated, but at the same time, what Citi is doing is the same thing that Chase Manhattan is doing. It's the same thing that BNZ is doing. It's the same thing that Barclays in the UK is doing. So why don't we create a product that white labels all of those functionalities, and then we can sell that to essentially sell it to our competitors. So that became the work that I was doing at that point. That was really interesting. They had a little bit more success than that. And I got to a point after being in New York for a few years. At this point, I had had two kids. They were both in strollers. And I was walking up and down subway stairs in New York City winter with a kid strapped to my chest and a kid in the stroller. And said, the hell with this. This is way too big of a pain in the ass. The other thing that happened to me at that point was I wasn't sure if I was a really good engineer or if I was a good engineer that was surrounded by a bunch of average engineers. So I quit my job and drove out to San Francisco. And a couple of maybe 2 weeks later, a month later, I got a call from Netflix and they said, do you want to come in and interview for a job here? So I did that, and it was a really interesting time to be at Netflix. It was during the time when we shifted from DVDs to DVDs and streaming. It was also the point that we shifted into the cloud. So that was my original introduction into AWS, and that's been, gosh, I don't know, 12 years ago now. So I've been in AWS forever. It was also the point that the big data explosion happened. We were doing the Netflix challenge for the recommendation engine. That was part of the data science and engineering group. That was really trying to figure out how you do cloud stuff in an effective way and how you do cloud stuff at a multi-petabyte type of scale. So it was a really, really interesting time. And there were points that were incredibly frustrating, and there were points that were incredibly just amazing, not from a not only from a career standpoint, but just from the problems that we were solving standpoint. That was a big, like Apache kind of open source time. We were building out the Netflix, tech stack and that library, and a lot of that stuff became reusable. And I did that for about 4 years. I was a manager in the data science and engineering department, working on experimentation and then just general kind of solution architecture in that space. And I was the, I think, fourth longest tenured person of a team of about 75 in our data science and engineering group, and just pretty intense work for a number of years. And I got to a spot where my daughter was about to start kindergarten, and I got an opportunity to move to Sydney, and we kind of felt like it was our last best chance to move abroad at that point. Kind of want to make sure the kids settle a little bit and all of that kind of good stuff. So moved to Sydney, and I was back in the fintech space. It was a lot more aligned to my time on Wall Street, but it was really, really hard for me to shift back into that type of a culture. Like I had really gotten spoiled by the Silicon Valley, kind of tech scene, and the fintechs or the financial services space in Sydney didn't have the same appeal. So at that point, that was very much a leadership and solution architecture type of role. And then I took a job at Nike, where I became a expert engineer for them, which I mentioned because it's the stupidest title like ever. It's such a lame title. I don't know what would make me a expert, but so I went to Nike as their expert engineer, and was implementing a bunch of stuff around what we had learned at Netflix, and they were trying to make this move into becoming more modern in their tech space. The interesting thing about Nike was they have such an incredibly huge lead over their nearest competitor that they have very little motivation to actually do anything differently. And I was like, I think where that really manifested itself when I was there was recognizing that they yeah, I guess kind of showed itself is a better word for it, was their number one competitor isn't Adidas, it's Under Armour. So Under Armour is a lot smaller than Nike. So the lead that Nike has is just absolutely enormous. So they have these massive teams that are building out a bunch of stuff that they never really implemented, never really used. They have every flavor of every technology you could possibly imagine, and none of it really matters. Like they still sell shoes because LeBron James is a really good basketball player, and they are a fantastic marketing organization. So got some interesting things out of it. Got to play Nike's Dime for a little bit. Got to work at a really neat campus, but at the end of the day, it wasn't what I needed from a professional standpoint. So I left Nike and I created a company. That company primarily worked back in Silicon Valley with organizations that were looking to modernize their data tech stack. So it was building out like decoupled ephemeral distributed compute and elastic compute and scalable data in decoupled architectures. And then that organization started to change a little bit and became more of a product company, kind of backed into a biospace where we landed a contract and built a field product that frankly monitored like pig and cow feces to find out if there was any disease, and if there was, then you would recall meat or recall chicken, that type of thing. um, Not exactly the sexiest thing in the world, but it was interesting to build out. From there, built out a product that you could kind of imagine to be akin to Netflix's recommendation engine, but it was based on the cannabis industry. So you would be able to put in, maybe I have glaucoma and I want to have an edible and I want it to taste like fruit, and I want to be able to stay awake or something. Like these are the effects that I want to get out of this, and it would cross those those desires or the things that you don't want to have with a inventory of a cannabis dispensary, and it would provide you recommendations for what you should ask for, which is a far better experience than going back and talking to just some random person who's selling weed behind a counter just because now they can legally do it. The challenge with that, I really liked the product. I think the product landed really well. There were two really big problems. The first one was my screw. Well, they were both my screw up. But the first one that was my screw up was I didn't ask the customers what it was they wanted. I started to make assumptions based on what I thought the customers wanted. So I built out this really big analytic back end to it. And it allowed dispensary owners to be able to say, it's kind of like the old, I'm sure you guys have all heard at Walmart, they figured out if they raise the price or if people who buy diapers also buy beer, or you can raise the price of Kleenexes. If you put a sale on orange juice, I guess that kind of idea of what do people have in their carts, I kind of cart analysis. So I took all of this recommendation knowledge and I took all of this idea of like cart analysis and I brought those things together and I created this like big analytics stack for the back end. And dispensary owners were like, I don't know what this is. Like, I don't want any of this. Like, I like the front end, it's cool, whatever. But the back end, like none of that matters. So I would put like months into building out a product based on what I thought customers wanted. So I kind of took a overconfidence or borderline arrogance on what I thought the product should be, and that ended up biting me. The other thing that ended up biting me on that is, while cannabis is legal in the United States at a state by state level, it's not legal at a federal level. And the ramifications of that are that banks are all FDIC, which means they're federally insured. So if you have a cannabis business, you can't use a bank to do any of the transactions for it. So my $99 a month offering meant that I had to like drive dispensary to pick up cash and drive that home. It ended up just being like, this isn't feasible and it doesn't scale. And either I can move to Canada or I can continue to or pivot off of that. Long about that time, I'm getting to the end, so bear with me. Long about that time, America was dealing with the same thing that we've seen over the last 2 days. There were mass shootings after mass shootings. My kids were learning run, hide, fight. It's like a mantra that you teach children in elementary schools. Is first you run if you see a shooter, then you hide from them, and if they find you, then you try to fight it off. And got to a point where it's just like America's social system and their belief system just doesn't really align with my family and I anymore. So took an opportunity to move to New Zealand and took a job as the CTO of a product here called Trove, which is currently in a private beta release. So I can't give a whole lot out about it without people being on NDA, but what I can tell you is that our parent company is Forsyth Barr. Forsyth Barr is a 85-year-old financial services company here in New Zealand. Disruptive innovation, and technical transformation is really hard, if not impossible, to do at 85-year-old financial services companies or old and existing mature companies as a whole. So they started off, they created this as a separate wing and said, so these, tech people who dress in t-shirts and blue jeans, they can go do their t-shirt and blue jeans thing. They pushed us off into a separate building. And then we've built this company up to be now, I think it's 52 people or something like that, and preparing for a public launch for this thing. So you can kind of imagine what you can think about what that product probably gives you without me saying anything out loud. As part of that, my background, again, very heavy into the AWS space, and at this point, very much into cloud native. Got really into serverless, got really into microservices and macro services and function as a service and event-driven architectures. And that's the architecture that we have in place now at Trove. So AWS had me come up and do this is our architecture. If you've ever seen any of those, this is my architecture like series that they do. They're like 3-minute videos. We did one that hasn't been released yet because the product hasn't been released yet. But it talks about that, and the only reason I mention that isn't to act like I'm cool, because I certainly am not. It's to reinforce that what we are doing from a technical perspective, from an architectural perspective within Trove, is extremely kind of I don't want to say bleeding edge. It's further along than that, but it is pretty cutting edge modern stuff. And I think if we've got a little bit of time at the end of this, and we want to talk a little bit about technology trends that I'm seeing, that's one that I'll really call out, and we can talk a little bit more about what that really means. What is event driven? What's the difference between microservices and SOA is a really good example. Those are the type of things that I think are helpful for people who are at an earlier point in their careers. So the last slide that I have here, and I just call out a couple of things that I think are really, really important. I wouldn't say these are the top things that I've ever learned, but as I was trying to satisfy my wife's opinion of, I don't agree with your presentation, I was like, oh, I'm going to try to capture some things that might be interesting to people, and these are the ones that I kind of came up with. One of the things that I would recommend to folks is to really give startups some thought. I think anytime you are in a mature organization and those structures exist and they are really ingrained in the DNA of a company, it's hard to understand how everything fits together. And when you're in a startup and you are a smaller organization, you get to wear a lot of hats. And I think that's a really, really valuable way to accelerate what it is you are going to, what it is you're going to learn. The other one that I call out, and I know this one makes people cringe a little bit, because I think we all focus, and it's very trendy right now to talk about work-life balance, which is very much an important thing. If we can squint a little bit and recognize that some of what we saw or read maybe in that Gladwell book, that 10,000 hours, if there's any grain of truth to that, then the way to tip those scales is to accelerate how long it is before you accumulate the hours necessary to be good at a thing. And that doesn't mean you're working 90 hours a week. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am going to say is somebody who remembers what it was like to be young, you have a different set of responsibilities. I didn't have kids at the time, as an example. I was younger. I mean, these are back in the days where you could go out drinking until 2 a.m. and still wake up the next day. That doesn't happen at 49 anymore, I can assure you. You just have a little bit more strength, and you have a little bit more of an ability to tip those scales in your direction. And Cal Newport's an author that I really like. He wrote a book called Too Good to Be Ignored. He also wrote a book called Deep Working or something like that, if I remember correctly. In the book Too Good to Be Ignored, he talks about you have to accumulate career capital. And if we can all agree that career capital is something that gives us experience and knowledge, then one way to accelerate that is to put the effort in to be able to accumulate it faster. So, again, I'm not asking anybody, and I don't ask anybody in the teams that I manage, or the companies that I build, to work more than their full-time hours. But I do tell young people, if you have the capability to accelerate that, there is a way for you to tip those scales a little bit. The other one that I want to call out here is this idea of it is hard to be great at something without being a little bit obsessed with it. And I think right now I'm really, really into reading autobiographies and biographies of founders. I just read the autobiography of Dyson, the guy who invented the vacuum cleaner, which sounds like, you're gonna read a book about a vacuum guy, but guy, he was obsessed with creating a better vacuum, and doing it in a really, really disruptive, innovative way, and it was really, really interesting. Walter Isaacson has written things on Da Vinci and Steve Jobs, and they're both just absolutely fascinating. Bob Dylan's autobiography is fantastic. I read the last one I'm gonna call out here is I recently read a book called The Fish That Ate the Whale, and it's about a guy who owned a banana company, and like the 1800s, and he's like this Russian Jewish refugee who lived in Alabama who got really obsessed with finding speed where other people acted slowly, and just taking that obsession and making it kind of the centerpiece for what it was that he wanted to accomplish. And I think there is something about just being a little bit obsessed about what it is you do for your career, and just taking that pride in yourself and taking that pride in the fact that, you know, this is something that you do for half of your waking hours. You might as well be great at it. You know, it's going to bring us all back together with where I started on it. Just call up that Kara Lawson again. Like, this never going to be easy, and being obsessed about something is a way that, for me at least, I handle hard better. Yeah, I guess I'll just kind of leave it at that. So I've been babbling for, let's see, 40 minutes now. So I'm going to stop my presentation and maybe open it up, and we can hopefully have a little bit of a conversation.
Yeah, that was so good, Joel. I love that so much. I've actually been taking crazy notes.
Well, thank you.
So I think I'm in that percentage that you were talking about at the start. I thought that was so good. But there's a question here from Chris in the chat. How do you make sure that you don't burn out while working at or running a startup?
Yeah, fantastic question. All cards on the table. It's happened. You know, I think there's no shame in admitting that I've gone over the edge on it before. You know, I've had a handful of companies, and the one that I have been at, you know, I did 3 years of just ridiculous hours, and trying to juggle way too many things. And it was, you know, it was really time for me to just kind of step away from it. And my solution for that was to literally step away from it for weeks on end and just say, I really have to get a break. Again, from the background that I come from, and that twofold. One of them is very unremarkable background. Like I said, I'm a big believer, though, that chips on shoulders equate to chips in pockets. Like, I really, really believe that. And I've always worked really hard to make up for the fact that I am such a generally unremarkable person. And you know, worked early in my life, and continue to have worked too much. But it is something that I have learned. I think a big one for me on the recover was step away and get back grounded into what it is that's really, really important for me. I'm obsessed by the professional side of it. Like I said, I really like it. I love the challenges of it. I love technology. But at the same time, I also love my kids, and I love my wife. And it's really, really important for me to take that time to step back. So the big one for me, I guess, is you know, I guess as I've unintentionally called out, I have not only a supportive wife, but one who's very honest with her opinions with me. Luckily, we are both very much New York in that sense. So, which I just have to tell you a quick side note story. It's just going to take a second. For anybody who is a Seinfeld fan, this probably is going to be as interesting. But for those who aren't, there's Seinfeld is a show that has a cast of basically 4 stars. And one of them is this kind of like really silly neighbor. His name is Kramer. And Kramer never has a job of any like a real job. He always has a series of like side hustles, and he always finds himself in these really, really silly you know, like positions. There's one episode where he's riding a city bus, and a bad guy gets on who has like a knife or something like that, and a brawl ensues, and Kramer, the silly neighbor, ends up driving the bus and trying to fight off this like urban terrorist. And he's telling the other individuals in the cast, he's telling Jerry and George, is like, you know, so I'm fighting this terrorist off, and you know, every time I go to a stop and I open the door, I'm trying to kick him out the door. And Jerry goes, "You kept making the stops?" And Kramer goes, "Well, yeah, they kept ringing the bell." And I've always felt like that episode is me and my opinions. Like, if you don't want my opinions, stop asking me for them. And my wife is the same way. So she has been really the support that I need to be able to say, look, you really got to pump the brakes on this thing. This isn't doing well for your health. It's not, you know, you're just going too far. And I think, having somebody in my life is the way that I try to control when that burnout happens. But at the same time, I'm guilty of having it happen. And the way that I fix it is really just stepping away. But it's got to be big step aways, because the first week I'm still just in my own head trying to solve every problem under the sun. So it needs to be a 2-3 week kind of break. Luckily, New Zealand takes a very different approach to that than America does, and you actually can have time away. Plus, there's an awful lot of holidays in this country. I gotta say, it's a ton of holidays. It's fantastic.
Awesome. Santino,
Shoot,
did you
Santi.
want to ask a question?
Yeah, awesome. Hi, Joel. Thanks for coming to share some information with us.
Mhm.
Kind of on that topic of like differences in countries and all that. How did you find like adjusting when you were starting to work in a new country? Did you find like the work ethics
Mm.
and kind of the routine was different in different countries, or was it all
Yeah.
based on the business that you were working for?
No, a really good question. There's an author called Erin Meyer who writes a book called The Culture Map, which is absolutely fantastic, and I highly recommend it. She's also the co-author of No Rules Rules, which is Reed Hastings' book about Netflix culture. And she does a really, really good job of calling out like there are huge differences. And I've got a really international team here. And I'll give you an example. I've got a couple of Belgium and Dutch guys that work for me. And so I tend to have my one-on-ones with them, and I do the very American one-on-one, the kind of shit sandwich. Like, here's something really nice, and here's something really bad, and here's something really nice, and I would do this with them, and they would just be like, "Why are you telling me the nice stuff? Like, if you've got some negative feedback, just give it to me." So I've, again, as part of this just like ongoing continuous learning, I've made that investment to try to get better at it. What I have found about New Zealand is twofold. One of them, I think the tech startup scene is fantastic. Like, I like the tech startup scene so much better here than I liked it in Sydney. And Sydney was a lot more kind of traditional and corporate, whereas I think Kiwis have a tendency. You all probably know this. It was new to me, but you've heard of 8-wire. Like, it's this magic wire that fixes everything from, I don't know, cars to fence posts. That mentality of like, we are going to do whatever we need to do to get this thing over the line is something that I find just absolutely fantastic about Kiwis. And I have met some of the most intelligent and frankly best devs in New Zealand. So no change in the skill levels. In fact, I'm like really, really excited about the tech scene in New Zealand. What I will say is there's also a Kiwi idea of the beach, the batch, and the BMW, which is this like, if I get those three things, then I'm successful. And while I have absolutely no problem if that's what success means to a person, I think there is um, an opportunity for New Zealanders to take a little bit bigger swings if they want to. And I think it is our responsibility as leaders in that space and as tech people in that space to make sure that we're not kind of tall poppying those individuals. Like, it's a good thing for it would be great if Trade Me was eBay, right? Like, it creates jobs, and like there's some really positive things. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with not aiming for that level. But I think that it is important that we, as a community, support people who want to take big swings like that. Does that answer that question? A little babbly.
Yeah,
Okay.
100%. That's great. Thank you so much.
What else can I speak to? You want to talk about trends for a couple minutes, kind of things that I'm seeing in the tech space? Would that be at all of interest? Okay.
Yeah, great. Let's do that.
Yeah, cool. So the big things that I would talk to you all about, let's put Chat GPT to the side for a second. I think we're all excited about that, or nervous about it, or some combination. But let's just set that aside for a second. I think that A few years ago, everybody was talking to me about being cloud agnostic. Everybody wanted this solution. They wanted to be cloud agnostic. They didn't want to get locked into any sort of cloud provider. I think where we are now in 2023 is a little bit different than that. And that is that if you aren't going to be willing to take advantages of the services that are offered by your cloud provider, you're never going to actually be cloud native. So as an example of this, when I took over this company, it was originally sold as we're just going to get like these five kind of contractors, and one group is going to do the front end, and one group is going to do Salesforce, and one group is going to do the back end, and one group is going to manage the cloud, and I don't know what the other group was. They were going to do security or something like that. Not surprisingly, the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. I came in and I looked at it, and what I found when I pulled the covers back was the entire kind of technical architecture is what I will lovingly refer to as the Wellington reference architecture. What that meant was it was a microservices monolith front end container service on Fargate. Sitting behind that were about 100 RESTful APIs. Sitting behind that was a Postgres RDBMS with about 200 tables in it. And I was like, why in the world do we have this thing? And it turns out that, TradeMe and Xero both had that architecture. And then, of course, people left TradeMe and Xero and they went somewhere else and they implemented what they knew. I looked at that and I said, I'm going to sidetrack for 1 second. Bear with me on this. It's going to make sense, hopefully, in a second. I grew up on RDBMS, right? Like I really cut my teeth on RDBMS and relational databases and all of that stuff. Relational databases do not belong behind your front end. And the reason for that is a relational database and a relational model is designed back by COD in the 70s, I guess it was, because disk was really, really expensive. Right, a gigabyte of disk in 1981 was 500,000 USD for 1 gigabyte of disk. In 2016, it was under 2 cents. So the price of disk has gone almost to zero, but yet a relational model is completely designed around this idea of you only want to put data in one place on disk. You want to minimize how much of that disk you're using. Relational databases are great if I don't know the questions I'm going to ask. If I want to explore data, having relationships between tables is really, really important. If I have a front end and I put a button on that front end that says, update my profile, I know exactly the access pattern that I'm going to go into my database for. What we see happen when we leverage RDBMS as a back end for front end is you end up having traverse all these tables, and that becomes really problematic. So you start to build all these indexes. That still doesn't ever naturally serve your needs, so you end up building cache layers. On top of that, you will take solutions and say, well, look, we need a read replica of our RDBMS because the thing that's updating the database, we don't want it to be the same one that we're reading from. You end up with some challenges in making sure that those things stay in sync. You also have to make sure that that read replica has a backup. That backup has to be in another region. And what are you building here? You end up with VPCs, and VPCs have subnets, and subnets have internet gateways. Like you build all of this infrastructure to deal with the fact that the reason we have the relational model in the first place is because in the 1970s, disk was really, really expensive. So if you start to rip all of that stuff away and say, what do we really need? We've got a front end, and we know the questions that we're going to ask. We know what our query patterns are. We know what our access patterns are. Why aren't we leveraging something like DynamoDB, a wide key value store, which is what we ended up doing here. We took 200 tables, and we got it down to one. So one table that sits behind, we got rid of our VPCs, our subnets, our internet gateways. We don't have read replicas. We don't need a cache layer because we can get single-digit millisecond response times just out of the box on this stuff. But the reason I give you all of this is that is one really small example of what the services of your cloud can provide. Lambda is another really good example, right? I don't need containers for my Lambda. I don't have to provision any of that stuff. I get 1 million Lambda calls free per month. The next million costs me 20 cents or 25 cents, something like that. If you're leveraging cloud native correctly, you get the most important things, which is elasticity, so the ability to scale into zero. We are in New Zealand. We've got 5 million Kiwis. 3.2 million of them are full-time employed. Like, if you have a successful product in this country, you have let's say 500,000 customers, something like that, depending on what your product is, of course. So that means at 3 in the morning, I probably don't need the same type of infrastructure that I need at 5 p.m. And being able to have elasticity, or things that scale in as easily as they scale out, is a key component to I guess, manipulating the pricing model that the cloud provides us. But it means that we have to start thinking about these problems in a slightly different way. And it means that we have to start to accept the fact that one of these trends being around cloud native is a really positive thing, but it means that we are no longer cloud agnostic. It means that we are locking into a vendor, and we have to accept that fact. So I think that's a really important. The other one that I think that Kiwis are going to experience in the next couple of years, it's going to be a really impactful change. I don't think we leverage data here in the way that we could be leveraging data. I think there's a whole lot of opportunities that we see coming in analytics and in something like machine learning, which I know it's been commoditized a little bit, but just understanding what that stuff looks like, understanding what neural networks do, all of that stuff, I think, is a trend that we're going to see here. The thing I like about data a lot is it can take underrepresented communities in the tech space, which is something that's very dear to me. Is we need to get more women in the tech space. We need to get more underrepresented, Maori or whatever those communities might be. And one way to do that is to find on-ramps. And I think data is a really nice on-ramp for people to be able to shift into tech without having to go get a computer science degree. So I think that's going to be another trend that we see. Pulling to something like what take to complete, Santino? You said something like that. Take to complete. What is that?
Yeah, something like the infrastructure of like 200 tables being in place for so long. How long? Like, what's the kind of like turnover in terms of
really
like getting it down to one?
Yeah, I think most of the time you're going to find those type of migrations. You are better off taking a strangler pattern to it and saying, what happens if I keep that existing 200 table RDBMS stood up, but I stand up a wide key value store, single table design backend for front end alongside of it, and slowly start to strangle those things over. So the way that you do that is you do a change data capture on your RDBMS, and you put a translation into the other side to make sure that those things are kept in sync. But for us, that took 4 months, maybe something like that. It was a solid quarter. I think as much as anything, it was getting us all to start thinking about these things in the same way and start thinking about these things cloud native. And, quite frankly, one of the things that I'm trying to do, and one of the reasons I like to get involved with folks like Jana and Amber, is gives me an opportunity to reach out into these communities and start to bring some of these ideas and start to build them up, starts us thinking about it and drawing pictures about them, building little projects and that type of thing. Building that kind of mindset is as hard as anything else. So I think what you all are doing is really, really neat. And I'm very, very supportive of the work that that Next Work does and that Amber does.
Awesome.
It was good timing to end.
Yeah. I was about to say that kind of perfectly wraps it up. Honestly, that was such an amazing session. I've been dropping notes in the chat, but I also have them on my own, just a list of the books that you're talking about and some of the things that you're recommending. Yeah, my mind is buzzing, and I know that like a lot of other people are just, Santino, you seem really, to get a lot out of it too. So thank you so much, Joel. That was absolutely fantastic. Yeah.
Cool. If anybody has any questions or wants to talk any further, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm sure Amber can share my info with you, but I'd love to hear from you. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk today, and thank you all for making the time.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Joe. Thank you.
Have a good day.
And we'll catch you next time. Bye. Oh, see you guys. So good. Have a good one. Bye, everyone.